On This Week in Enterprise Tech, we have Mr. Curtis Franklin, Mr. Brian Chee here today. Now, Parler is continuously in the news from data leaks to antitrust lawsuits. We'll get into it and review some of their security practices. Plus, who really is responsible for protecting physical security systems from cyber attacks? Well, is it you? Well, we'll talk about it. Well, if you've heard of all the ransomware attacks out there, people are all talking about cybersecurity insurance. The question is it a double-edged sword? We'll get into it. We have a lot to discuss here. You shouldn't miss it. It's Wyatt on the set.
Podcasts you love
from people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is TWiT, This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 427, recorded January 22nd, 2021. Insure Your Bits. This episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by Barracuda. Did you know that 91% of all cyber attacks start with an email? To uncover the threats hiding in your Office 365 account, get a secure and free email threat scan at barracuda.com/enterprise. And by Thanks Canary. Detect attackers on your network while avoiding irritating false alarms. Get the alerts that matter. For 10% off and a 60-day money-back guarantee, go to canary.tools/twit, enter the code TWIT in the How Do You Hear About Us box. Welcome to TWiT, This Week in Enterprise Tech, the show that is dedicated to you, the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and that geek who just wants to know how this world is connected. I'm your host, Louis Maresca, your guide through this big, giant world of the enterprise. Although I don't want to guide you by myself, I need to bring in the professionals, the experts in their field, starting with our very own Mr. Brian Chee. He's the net architect at Sky Fiber, the geek in paradise, and soon to be the happy traveler. Cheebert, how are you, and how's the moving coming?
We are really excited. We had our first showing. Actually, the house doesn't even go on the market till today. But yesterday, we had a Navy lieutenant commander come over to visit the house and have a pre-show, and he liked it. He was saying, I want to move in tomorrow, so crossing our fingers. But yes, you can see the stunt furniture in the back. We actually had a real interior designer come in to stage the house to make it look a little more lived in and have furniture so you could tell how big the spaces are. Lots of fun.
It's really great. It's great. Well, good luck with I'm sure, anytime you do the staging, it always makes you feel like you got a new house. So I guarantee people will love it for sure. So good luck with that. Speaking of busy and speaking of a good guy, we have Mr. Curtis Franklin on today. He is the senior analyst at Omdia and an all-around amazing guy. He's also doing lots of things in the security world. Curtis, how are you doing, and how's the security world treating you?
Oh, well, the security world is treating me fine because the bad guys are continuing to do stuff. The good guys are continuing to fight them. And between the two, I have lots to talk about. So I do appreciate the job security.
Indeed. Well, we do have lots to talk about, so let's go ahead and get started because it's been quite the week in enterprise and IT news. In fact, Parler is continuously in the news from data leaks to antitrust lawsuits. We're going to get into it and review some of their security practices. And who really is responsible for protecting physical security systems from cyber attacks? Is it you? Well, we'll talk about it. And if we have time, if you've heard about all the ransomware that's going around, people are talking about cybersecurity insurance. The question is it a double-edged sword? We'll get into that as well. But before we get into all that fun stuff and all that goodness, we have to talk about this week's news blips. Now, there has been a ton of excitement around the Apple ARM-based M1 processor, and it's now making its way through its laptop line. Personally, I think the tech market has a short-term memory here, seeing ARM has been on some pretty nice Windows devices for a while. In fact, I've been using the new 64-bit emulation version of Windows on ARM, and the thing is pretty fast. Now, what if I told you can now run Linux on machines using the Apple M1 processor as well? Now, Corellium, a company specializing in ARM virtualization and developer tools, has successfully ported Linux to Apple's new M1 powered Mac Mini. Now, it's not perfect yet, but it works. Think about pretty much the potential here. It's only a matter of time that it actually gets stabilized. Now, Corellium is known for its Corellium hypervisor on ARM, aka Charm, a Type 1 hypervisor used to run Linux in a virtual machine on bare metal. However, that's not what the company is actually doing here. It doesn't actually run on Charm. The M1 Linux port runs on bare metal. Now, if you're interested, the port is actually available on GitHub as open source. It's able to run on the actual desktop version of Ubuntu. Now, this initial Linux M1 Mac code has been pushed upstream to Linux kernel developers, and Corellium is looking to work with the developers behind the crowd-funded Asahi group or Linux project group. Now, Asahi has already made some progress on the M1's proprietary GPU architecture. Now, thinking about this more, just the potential of this running efficiently opens the door to many other OS possibilities. I, for one, am rooting for Corellium and Asahi.
Well, I'll root for them, but just because you're Linux doesn't mean you're safe. 2 dangerous new botnets have emerged in recent days targeting Linux-based systems worldwide. One of them, dubbed Dreambus, is malware with worm-like behavior that's capable of propagating itself both across the internet and laterally through compromised internal networks using a variety of techniques. Researchers at Zscaler, who recently analyzed the threat, described Dreambus as a modular piece of malware targeting Linux applications running on hardware systems with powerful CPUs and lots of memory. The Dreambus botnet's been assembled from systems the malware has compromised, and it's currently being used to deploy the XMRig CPU miner to mine Monero cryptocurrency. But the same malware can easily be repurposed to deliver other, more dangerous payloads like ransomware and malware for stealing and holding data at ransom. Now, in an interesting note, when I spoke with Deepan Desai, Zscaler's director of research, he told me that they could see CNC commands transmitting every morning around 0900 Ukraine time, indicating both that a human is directing the botnet and that they're working standard office hours. Meanwhile, Check Point earlier this week said it had observed a botnet, which it's called Freakout, targeting systems running vulnerable versions of the TerraMaster operating system for network-attached storage servers. Also, targeting web apps and services using the Zend framework and the LifeRay portal CMS. Machines that the malware is compromised have been assembled into a botnet, and in this case, it's being used in DDoS attacks for crypto mining and other nefarious purposes.
Well, this is actually kind of an odd story because Google's agreeing to pay French news sites to send them traffic. So let's dig into this. French news sites have prevailed in negotiations with Google over neighboring rights, a new legal right granted by the 2019 EU Copyright Directive. An agreement between Google and the French news industry, quote, establishes a framework within which Google will negotiate individual licensing agreements with individual news organizations, according to Google. Under these deals, French news articles will be featured in a new Google product called News Showcase. This isn't the outcome Google wanted. For years, European news agencies have tried to force Google to pay them for the privilege of indexing their articles, and for years, Google flatly refused to do so. When Spain passed legislation to force Google to pay to link to Spanish news organizations in 2014, Google responded by shutting down Google News in Spain. Google has tried to use that same playbook in France after the passage of the EU Copyright Directive, but France was the first country to transpose the EU directive into its own laws. In 2019, Google announced it was going to stop displaying snippets from French news articles in search results. Google believed that showing only news story headlines, not brief excerpts from articles, would bring it into compliance with the new law. That fooled them. In my opinion, this has been influenced by what has been happening in the world of academic journals, where libraries end up having to pick up huge tabs for publishers to index academic papers. I, for one, will be really interested to see just where this landmark case takes us on providing access to emerging articles from all industries.
Speaking of influence, we've talked a lot about some of the U.S. executive orders over the last year and how they've affected organizations. Well, President Biden has wasted no time here this week to getting down to work and signing no fewer than 17 executive orders. And many of these reversed decisions that were taken by the previous administration. Now, 2 of them are actually concerning immigration. Now, one of them extends the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program for another 4 years and overturned the Trump administration's travel bans on mostly Muslim-majority countries. The administration also plans to drop a new bill that would provide 11 million undocumented immigrants with a pathway to citizenship and an 8-year waiting period before becoming permanent residents. Now, without reservation, several large tech organizations jumped on the bully pulpit to express their gratitude here. Apple's Tim Cook welcomed President Biden's commitment to pursuing comprehensive immigration reform, and Google's Sundar Pichai actually applauded the immediate actions and changes to immigration. But all things aside, reform is always part of a new president's regime. Now, the market has reacted to these changes to show support, and I, for one, hope this is just the start of the light at the end of a very long tunnel.
Hey, looking for stolen credentials? Just try Google. The attackers behind a summer 2020 phishing campaign accidentally exposed the credentials they stole to the public internet, where they could be discovered with a simple Google search. Last August, the operators launched a campaign with malicious emails disguised as Xerox scan notifications. Now, Checkpoint researchers reported on an analysis conducted alongside industrial cybersecurity firm Otorio that the recipients of these emails, which contained their first name or company title in the subject line, were prompted to open an HTML attachment. If the file was opened, a JavaScript code would run in the background to conduct password checks, send the data to the attacker's servers, and then redirect the victim to a legitimate Microsoft 365 login page where they could enter credentials. It sounds like a simple infection chain, but it successfully bypassed Microsoft 365 Advanced Threat Protection and stole the credentials of more than 1,000 employees. Over the course of the campaign, attackers adjusted their code to make the attack seem more realistic so victims wouldn't think twice about entering their data. They then stored the stolen data on some fairly simple and, as it turns out, relatively unprotected WordPress sites. It was saved in publicly visible files that could be indexed by Google. And we all know what Google does. Those spiders are out there indexing every chance they can. Anyone, it turns out, could find the stolen information with a Google search, which is precisely what the researchers did. With all the information that was freely available, researchers analyzed roughly 500 of the stolen credentials, found that the greatest percentage of victims worked in construction, with energy, information technology, and healthcare following as the most affected industries.
In the topic of what we hope is good news, Democrat Jessica Rosenworcel, pardon me for mangling her name, replaces Ajit Pai and is now acting FCC chairwoman. President Joe Biden yesterday appointed Democrat Jessica Rosenworcel to be the acting chairwoman of the Federal Communications Commission. Rosenworcel became FCC commissioner in 2012 and served in a Democratic majority during the Obama years and in a Democratic minority during the Trump years. Quote, I am honored to be designated as the acting chairwoman of the Federal Communications Commission by President Biden, Rosenworcel said in a statement. I thank the president for the opportunity to lead an agency with such a vital mission and talented staff. It is a privilege to serve the American people and work on behalf to expand the reach of communications opportunity in the digital age. Now, while Rosenworcel is the acting chair, she is a supporter of net neutrality and, if confirmed, could very well overturn quite a bit of what outgoing chair Ajit Pai has done during the Trump administration. Perhaps another example of the Biden administration's intent to erase Trump's changes as their first actions in office.
Now, does your organization still have on-premise data centers, or maybe even co-located data centers? Well, what if I told you that you could use AI to predict when your server hard drives would fail? Well, we've all had hard drives fail on us before, and it's often as sudden as booting your machine and realizing you can't access a bunch of files. Well, it's really not fun. Now, it's especially not fun when you have an entire data center full of drives that are actually all important to keeping your business running. That's where predictive drive failure at Datto steps in for you. Now, first and foremost, to make a prediction, you need data, of course. Now, hard drives have a built-in utility called SMART, which is self-monitoring analysis and reporting technology that reports various statistics about how the hard drive is actually functioning. Now, Datto collects a report with many of those data attributes from each drive once per day. Now, the first iteration of predictive drive failure uses attributes values to make useful predictions and alert if any of their values pass below the associated thresholds. Now, the next iteration of the drive failure prediction was actually assigning a weighted health score to each of the drives. Now, this score was defined by assigning weight to several different attributes based on how severe they appeared and then adding them together. Now, finally, they use Smarter CTL, which is actually a machine learning model using Smart's most attributes and to actually make it more informed prediction possible. Now, how accurate and successful is this modeling approach? Well, after a large run, they actually found it to be 99.92% accurate. Now, there is a caveat to the data. Now, out of the 400,000 or so reports from healthy drives, only about 215 reports were actually failed drives. But the data shows that the model is strong to predict true negatives, but weak on false positives. That means there isn't a silver bullet yet. Now, Smarter CTL is a fun project that revealed how a fleet of hard drives has behaved and evolved. However, it's unlikely that smart stats alone will ever be the key to predicting drive failure with a high degree of accuracy. Now, it does mean that soon in a data center near you won't have to wake up in the middle of the night to service your storage. Well, folks, that does it for the blips. Next up, the bites. But before we get to the bites, we have to thank a really great sponsor of This Week in Enterprise Tech, and that is Barracuda. You may have heard of advanced threat protection, especially as part of the current climate. It's something you want to have for your organization. Well, Barracuda is the provider of cloud-enabled, enterprise-grade security solutions that protect email, networks, data, and applications. Suddenly, you have dozens, hundreds, or maybe even thousands of employees working remotely, each one of them getting a ton of email every day, making them vulnerable. 91% of all cyber attacks start in an email. It could be spear phishing, ransomware, account takeover, conversation hijacking. Now multiply that by how many employees you have times how many emails they get. Think about all the threats that are landing out there. One click on the wrong email can cost you money, customers, and even your reputation. Barracuda researchers have seen a steady increase in the number of coronavirus-related spear phishing attacks since last January. They've observed a recent spike of 667% in this type of attack since the end of last February. Get the protection you need for your company with Barracuda Total Email Protection. Now, it includes all-in-one email security, backup, and archiving, AI-based protection from spear phishing, account takeover, and business email compromise, and automated incident response that gives you options to quickly and efficiently address attacks, plus security awareness training to educate your workforce so your employees can be the first line of defense against attack. Now, many people are looking to get the latest on COVID-19 and maybe even the status and availability of the vaccine, and I see emails masked as informational ones that really tug at our emotions and our interest strings, which are pointers to potential attacks. Now, I started using Barracuda Total Email Protection, which, by the way, has an incredible dashboard, and it gives you a complete view of potential threats and mitigations. In fact, right now, there are new attacks impersonating organizations like the World Health Organization. In fact, attackers utilize domain spoofing and promise information related to coronavirus to trick users into phishing scams. Ensure the safety and security of your business with Barracuda. To uncover the threats hiding in your inbox, get a secure, free email threat scan of your Office 365 account, risk-free at barracuda.com/enterprise. That's barracuda.com/enterprise. Barracuda, your journey secured. And we thank Barracuda for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Well, folks, it's now time for the bites. Now, of course, we got to start with Parler because Parler's been in the news quite a bit. And, they've been a center of many discussions and controversies over the past year. Now, just recently, they also found themselves in a debate around antitrust where large cloud providers actually shut them down because they didn't like their content. Now, they sued Amazon AWS because of it. Some of its users didn't know of reports, but Parler was actually sharing users' data to authorities regarding the recent riots in Washington. In addition to Parler voluntarily sharing their data, Numerous public websites have now published scraped data that included death threats and geotagged deleted messages from the service. Now, let's discuss how this is happening. Now, even in the light of the site going down, then coming back up, and then going back down very soon after that, a hacker who goes by the Twitter handle DonkNB started by downloading every Parler post from January 6th, searching for incriminating evidence. Now, according to the reports, organizations that were part of the riot used Parler to coordinate their charge on the Capitol building. Now, when the news broke that AWS was taking down Parler, the hacker got to work scraping all of Parler's public records. Now, they were actually able to scrape 70 terabytes from Parler. That's a lot of data. Now, DonkNB, they then uploaded that data to the Internet Archive. Now, since then, there have been several copies of that data. Now, DonkNB tweeted the Parler data, including deleted and private posts and videos containing all associated metadata. So all the data was embedded in there still. Now, there were rumors that data has been swiped from Parler because Twilio forbade Parler from using its program. It removed Parler's ability to authenticate its accounts. However, Twilio has responded and debunked the false claims here. But now legitimate users of the service, possibly a relative near you, may not have shared their phone numbers with Parler, but that doesn't matter because they didn't actually erase the image and video metadata, including the GPS information. Now, this data now readily available and can be used to trace down, Parler users and their real identity and their locations. Not good. Now, in the data scrape, deleted messages were also captured. That's because Parler's proprietary program didn't delete them. Instead, it merely marked them to be invisible. They just hid them, which is very odd. Now, it's really hard to read these reports because it surfaces some really bad engineering techniques, and it's also very bad programming and security. Now, part of the root problem here is called out by Kenneth White. He's a co-director of Open Crypto Audit Project, and he described the core problem stemming from using a simple addition of one to its chronological message URLs, established an insecure digital object reference, or IDOR, problem. Put it all together, and you don't need to have access to administrative rights or be a mad hacker genius to actually access the data. Now, the technology moral of the story here, what is it? Or if you're going to write something that actually is to be private and secure in social network, it behooves you to have any clue about security. Okay, I want to throw this to my co-host because I think there's a lot to talk about here, and I think there's a lot to poke at. Curtis, I want to start with you. What do you think? I mean, do you think Parler was there for a purpose and they didn't really care about privacy and security?
Well, to me, the interesting thing is that Parler claimed that they were far more interested in privacy than any of the other social networks. Right. They were drumming on the we don't collect all this information. We don't share the information with people like Cambridge Analytica and all of that. Privacy, privacy, privacy was what they were drumming at. And many of my conservative friends talked about that privacy as one of their reasons for going to Parler. Now, this is a great opportunity to look at the distinction between privacy and security. Privacy talks about what is done with your personally identifiable information, or PII. Security is how well they take care of your PII. And to give a great example, in the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica case, your personal data was quite secure, but it wasn't very private because Facebook sold it to Cambridge Analytica in what was for them a completely legitimate and highly secure transaction. In Parler's case, the lack of security, or the security failure, resulted in a privacy failure as well. And I think that is, you could say, ironic, but I think it's a case of people behind the service not being as concerned with privacy as they said they were, and not being nearly as skilled at programming as they should have been. And that latter piece could well have been the result of a simple lack of funding. Really good programmers don't come cheap. And this was not an immensely funded operation. But it really does point out the difficulties in maintaining true security, which leads to good privacy, especially if you don't control your infrastructure.
Right, right. Chee, I want to throw this to you because there was a lot going on for Parler here. Was there a kryptonite behind their service here? What were they doing that could be the wrong thing here that started this all?
Well, obviously, I can only speculate. I don't have a crystal ball, and I certainly wasn't involved with them at all. But if I was to, say, put on my computer science instructor hat, one, I'd give them an F, maybe a D for at least having a solid idea. But it's kind of like what some of my students have done in the past when they did projects. They had one student that was really good at marketing. They were the idea person, but they were so abrasive they couldn't attract any of the talent in the class. So they ended up with people that would just take toolkits and borrow modules and just drop them in without really understanding them. Because the reality is the rumor I heard is a lot of this was based on Python. Python has some very good modules, but the good modules take some talent to implement. AWS has some very good database systems, and they actually do have ways that when you delete a record, it actually shreds the record. It overwrites it. So from an instructor's standpoint, this was, I want to say, it looks like a lazy implementation. I hesitate really calling it that just because I don't want someone hitting me with slander. But there were modules, there were pieces out there that were available to them that they could have used. But like Curt said, talent costs money. And That's right. Looks like someone didn't pay attention to securing the data or even using modules that were free that could have solved those issues without too much trouble.
Well, Curt, Lou, I've got a question that I want to ask you. You manage developers and development efforts. And while I don't think you have ever built a social network, I would argue that you probably have a concept of the scope that a project like that would be. So my question is, if someone came to you and said, Lou, we want you to build from the ground up a social network that has many Facebook-like features, but none of the problems. We just want, basic thing. How big a team would you want to assemble to make a project like that happen in, let's say 6 months, just to put a pin in some sort of date? What would you want to put together for that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it depends on the goals of the network. Like, I think most people, like you said, Parler was focusing on, being a secure social network where you can say what you want and, nobody can know your identity and so on. These types of social networks, obviously, social networks are meant to be open platforms. They're meant to be platforms where you can express and talk to people that you know and get to know them and connect through your social graph and so on and so forth. So anonymity is an interesting goal of a social network. Now, how big of a team would I assemble? I would assemble based off of the goal. Now, if it's a goal to be, fairly secure and really good privacy, obviously, and make sure that I wasn't using my users' data or people weren't seeing my users' data, then I would also make sure I get people who are, A+ and experts in the area around data compliance and around data storage and around, client storage and client data usage and that kind of thing. So you're talking 3, 4, 5, maybe even 10 people right then and there because of just the sheer scale of what social networks do. And of course, you need infrastructure people and back-end people and storage people, and of course, performance people and client people. So I would say at the very minimum, you need at least 50 people. I mean, that's just a ballpark figure of in the past building clients of any particular scale. I know that, like, for instance, back in the day, we heard that Diaspora or those other social networks that were coming up, and they were built with like a 5 to 8 person team. And that's true. You can go and build a social network that has some level of, data and some level of sharing content on it with that many people. The question is it going to have the features you need? Is it going to have the security and privacy you want? And it's got the scale that you want. It could cost, and again, depending on how you do it, it could be very costly. So, like you guys were saying, Python's a single-threaded runtime, and you have to be very good at the language and the environment in order to get really good performance and as well as really good security out of it. If you're using other technologies that are, backends that are, multi-threaded, again, you have to have other skills and other capabilities to understand how to cache correctly and how to scale it correctly. So, could you do it with a 10-person team? Yes, but again, if you're looking for all the goals of making sure that you're secure and you're private and you have the scale that you want, and you make sure that you have the that you're making sure the client is a really great experience, both on mobile and web and on desktop, then you're going to need a lot of people, and you're going to need a lot of people of skill, a specific skill to do these things and to work together to do it. And again, you have to have people that can lead those people as well and make sure that they don't, go down a rat hole. So again, to answer your question, there's a lot to go with it.
Yeah, and I will say, based on what I know, that if you're talking about 50 people, you've just rolled past $10 million a year in HR costs. Right. Especially if you start, wanting to give them benefits. All of a sudden, you're talking easily $10 to $15 million a year. And that's without getting into the staff cost to support those 50 people. So this is not an inexpensive thing. And Lou, let me ask you another question. We know now that they were being hosted by one of the big public clouds. Now, back in the day, CompuServe rolled their own. As a matter of fact, they were one of the huge, consistent buyers in the used PDP-10 and PDP-20 market, because that's what CompuServe ran on. And for probably a decade, they snapped up every used machine that came onto the market, just so they had enough to run their farm. And again, let's say you have been made king of this particular entirely theoretical project. Would you be happy putting it on any public cloud? Or is this the kind of thing where, to maintain privacy, to maintain regulatory compliance around PII, especially if you've got European customers, is this something where you would feel like at least part of the infrastructure would need to be something that you controlled rather than something you were leasing or renting on a monthly basis from a cloud provider?
Yeah, I think exactly that. I think the latter. I think if you needed to meet all these compliance and regulatory states, you definitely need to have a hybrid situation where you're storing the data in one place. And then have users be able to access it just in time in another place. So the data flow, there's no storage of data in any particular area that could be uncompliant or insecure and that kind of thing. And so now these rented servers are more for scale of serving up static files, like just your UI components and in that kind of thing. And then you're talking about other things like images and data for images and processing those images. Any PII, back in the day, PII meant like people's names and their addresses and stuff like that. But nowadays, it's even more stringent. It could be names of companies, it could be names of local data on your machine. It could be information about your pictures, metadata that's embedded within. And so, like, a lot of these things would have to be stored on more private cloud scenarios that are then accessed by a public cloud infrastructure. or even sometimes private cloud infrastructure, depending on the audience. So if you have, government employees who want their, to talk to their social network, everything's going to have to be done that way. So yeah, I definitely think that if I were to be the master of this and I wanted to drive it up front and I wanted to drive security and compliance, I would definitely think about a more hybrid approach where I own a lot of the storage, or we put up a lot of the infrastructure for that.
You know what? I want a parting shot on this. How many of you remember that IT guy for Jurassic Park? One guy to run that whole. Doesn't it sound the same thing?
Yeah.
So I think our friends at Parler were building Jurassic Park on the cheap. What do you think?
I think that is one of the kinder explanations I've heard. And from what I've seen, none of their IT folks were nearly as good as Samuel L. Jackson. So, I think that's an important thing to point out as well.
Indeed.
What do you think? Shall we go to the next bite?
I think we should jump on to the next bite, because the next bite's a very interesting one. Who's going to take it away? Is it Brian?
Yeah, sure.
Curt?
So I've been doing a lot of work with the University of Hawaii Department of Public Safety. I did similar things with the U.S. federal government. The problem is physical security systems are changing. I mean, they're really changing. The whole deal of having, a dedicated system that was air gapped from the world to run your physical access, your access control systems being completely separate from your cybersecurity, those days are gone. Just start reading any kind of magazine dedicated to building management, and you're going to see just how good, how much of a big deal this is. And you start hearing horror stories about physical plants, like big giant HVAC systems being turned over to a physical plant group that has zero IT background, and they don't even understand that they have to change the default passwords and find the HVAC system is now owned right out from under them and no air conditioning. So anyway, the question becomes, there are really good examples. Hollywood's actually done a pretty good job of starting to make more people aware. I'm going to use the 2007 movie Live Free or Die Hard. We all loved seeing Bruce Willis kick ass, all fun and games, but Justin Long was playing a hacker, and the hacker community kind of did a good job of highlighting how the physical world and cyber world are no longer really separate. And now we start having people, we have cameras everywhere. IoT is everywhere. But the problem is we start having people using really cheap cameras that have really, really old versions of the Linux kernel on it with all its associated vulnerabilities, and they're putting them on public networks. So I guess what we're saying is, who's really responsible for protecting the physical security systems from cyber attacks? I just had a presentation yesterday by Genetech, kind of an interesting system. It was one of the nicer systems where access control and video management systems and all kinds of things were kind of merged together. But we're talking about a system that ain't cheap. So anyway, let's get to the point. The reality is we have people that are used to living in boiler rooms that would be handling keys. We've got old time key guys going around rekeying locks, but access control isn't physical keys anymore. Physical keys are actually costing us way, way too much money. And card keys are better because if an employee loses a card key, you just say, dude, sorry, you got to buy your next card if you lose it again. And we just delete their old one and issue a new one. Big deal. Whereas, say at my last university, if you lost a key and it was fairly major, they would charge us $75 per laser cut key to replace and $1,000 per lock we had to change because they could no longer use that combination of pins ever again. So from a return on investment standpoint, if you're not thinking card key, you're spending too much money. So what I want to do is, there's some great examples, and I'm sure Curt wants to jump right in. The idea is, are we doing enough? Are the attitudes changing fast enough so that our physical plant people are actually working with IT, or are they still walled off from each other? What are you seeing in the world, Curt?
Well, it's interesting that you do see the two coming together, although it reminds me a great deal of the early 90s when we had the telephone group, the telecom group, and the IT group. And they were just beginning to come together in what at that time was called computer telephony. Now, of course, it's just telephone, because voice is carried as data just like any other data. But there was a time when the two were very separate, with very different cultures, very different physical plants, and different people running them. We're seeing them come together, although I have to say I am continually amused by the physical security people who try to embrace certain characteristics of IT security. And the predominant one here is what we're all familiar with as security through obscurity. That's basically the same concept that dogs use when they stick their head into a bag and figure that they're safe because they can no longer see you. If they can't see you, you can't see them, and they're secure. We see this from people who don't want to, for example, publish the name of a particular directory on their server, even though the server and all of its directories are still exposed to the internet. The two great examples I have is that for some time, maps of London did not include the BT Tower. Biggest thing in the skyline of London, but it wasn't on the maps because that meant that enemies could not target it, they said, in the event of some sort of airstrike. Because, if there weren't a map of it, they just wouldn't recognize the big pointy thing sticking up out of the middle of the city. The other one is near me, where a city has its well field for the water supply. Now, from the sidewalk, from the street, you can see these big honking well pumps. These things are easily 15 feet high, 5-6 feet in diameter. They look like big water well pumps, and there are a bunch of them, but they don't have a sign on the wall around it saying what it is. So obviously no one knows what it is, and it's safe. I think it's important as these things come together, as these functions come together, that they work to make the best of each type of security part of the final mix, rather than bringing over the silliness from the other.
Well, Lou, you're involved with Office, and one of the things that we did back in 2005, InfoWorld ran a security identity management shootout. And one of the scenarios is, what can you do if someone is using a card key swipe, but at the same time that identity is also doing a VPN authentication from, say, Germany? The future is someday that'll get caught, but I'm not sure it will. Have you started hearing conversations about how the cyber world or the IT infrastructure world and the physical security world are starting to talk to each other. What's your spin on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so I'm not going to give you any details about internally in Microsoft because that would be bad. But what I will do is I will say that I've talked to organizations, abroad, that as they start to implement this, because a lot of the remote workers are out there, of how they're doing this. And a lot of them are actually instituting systems that are using real-time streaming systems, data, network and physical hardware data streaming systems that can detect these types of things, where they'll detect anomalies in location and whether they're using VPN or so on and so forth. So, like for instance, if you use a mobile device as an authenticator, and you're using a VPN and you're connecting through a port, like through a tunnel, and also you have a desktop or a site that you're connecting to, like all of that kind of has to make sense. It has to come out of the same location, as well as the device has to report that it's in a particular location too. So like for instance, maybe the cellular network is on one part of the network and the VPN is another part of the network, and so on and so forth. And so, like a lot of these things are come into all these attributes are brought together, and they can actually detect these anomalies, and they use that for potential breach analysis and auditing systems and so on. Now, if obviously the attacker's smart enough, they will make sure that all of these things make sense, and as they log in. They log in at a time where no other user is going to log in. So like on the weekend, and they make sure that all of their locations in the same place. And so a lot of these systems break down because of that. But again, then the anomaly of them logging in on a weekend and then doing specific things and accessing specific data can also be a piece of that model as well. So I think that's a perfect example of there's still a good space for improvement here. But again, my guess is there's a lot of false positives as well when you're working with these systems, and so you have to make sure that you don't create too much of a problem for your users as well. So I think that it's a hard thing to solve, but I'm sure that in the coming months, in the coming years, there'll be more technology to help.
It sounds like the bottom line is, physical plant guys and IT guys kind of need to start talking to each other. I know lots of organizations have merged telecom and IT, so I'm not sure they belong under the same roof, but they certainly need to talk to each other. But you know what? We need to go and talk about one of our sponsors, and Lou, I think you've got that ready to go.
We do. Well, before we get to our next bite, we do have to thank another great sponsor of This Week in Enterprise Tech, and that is thanks to Canary. Now, the last thing anybody wants or needs right now is a data breach, right? Well, rather than being the villain lying in wait, you have a hero. That's Thanks Canary, and is waiting for them for you. Now, companies usually find out too late they've been compromised, even after they spent millions of dollars on IT security, and find out it wasn't enough. Now, Canary has completely changed the game here. It's designed to be installed and configured in minutes, and pardon the pun, left to its own devices. Now, you don't even have to think about it. Now, attackers prowling a target network look for juicy content, right? Well, they'll browse Active Directory for file servers and explore file shares looking for documents they want to steal. Well, they'll try default passwords against network devices and web services and scan for open services across the network. Well, canaries can be deployed throughout your entire network, and you can make them look identical to a router, a switch, a NAS server, a Linux box, or a Windows server, so attackers won't know they've been caught. Now, the Things Canaries are designed to look like the things that hackers want to take over. You could put fake files on them or even enroll them in Active Directory. Now, when attackers investigate further, they give themselves away and you're instantly notified. Now, you can also use Canary tokens. Now, these are tiny tripwires that you can drop into hundreds of places, and they follow the Things Canary philosophy of trivial to deploy with ridiculously high-quality signals. Now, if an alert happens, Canary will notify you any way you want. Plus, you won't be overwhelmed with false alarms because you get the alerts by either email or text message right on their great console there. Even on Slack or using webhooks or syslog or even their API, you choose the option that works best for you and your business. Now, it's important that companies know two things when it comes to data breaches. Now, one, hackers will usually take the path of least resistance, and that's typically your staff. And two, it takes on average 191 days for a company to actually realize there's been a data breach. So it's really too long, and Things Canary solves that problem for you. Now, people behind Canary have been in the security game for almost 2 decades and have trained companies like militaries and governments and how to actually break into networks. And that's the knowledge they've used to build Canary. Now, things Canary are deployed all over the world on all 7 continents and are one of the best tools against data breaches. Now, visit canary.tools/twit, and for just $7,500 per year, you'll get 5 Canaries, your own hosted console upgrade, support, and maintenance. And if you use the code TWIT in the How to Hear About Us box, you'll get 10% off the price for life. We know you'll love Things Canary, but if you're not happy, you can always return your Canaries with their 2-month money-back guarantee for a full refund. That's canary.tools/twit, and enter the code TWIT in the How Do You Hear About Us box. And we thank Things Canary for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Well, folks, it's now time for the next bite. Now, you know a whole other ransomware that's going around out there. Now, people are talking about cyber insurance, cybersecurity insurance. And the question is it really a double-edged sword? I want to throw it at you guys. Who wants to jump into this one? Because I think, a lot of a lot of us have heard around the pandemic, had a lot of ransomware going around, and a lot of companies are trying to bank in, say, hey, I'm going to use cyber insurance to save me. Is this, Curtis, is this you, or is this cheaper?
Yeah, let me take this one on, because I've talked to a number of different people, both the CISOs and risk analysis people at companies that purchase cyber insurance, and people from the cyber insurance companies. And, it's the concept is clear. It's treating the risks of your IT, and in some cases OT, but mainly IT resources, just like any other resource. So, your data, your application delivery chain, all of this is a resource, just like your building, your furniture, things like that. And so if they can be damaged, if they can have an impact on your business, then you can insure against that risk. It works well, but there have been a couple of, we'll call them side effects, one that's not very good and one that's quite good. Now, let's talk about the not good one first. Criminals seem to have a very good idea of what the insurance limits for ransomware are, especially when it comes to smaller towns, municipalities, government organizations like school districts. And that's why, for example, in 2019, we saw a number of smaller towns in Florida and Texas especially hit with ransomware attacks where the ransom that was demanded came in right at or just under what their protection limit was from cyber insurance. And in those cases, the municipality or the school system would say, sure, I'll pay it because I know I can turn right around and be reimbursed from my insurance policy. So in this case, we had the sort of thing that was incenting ransomware at a certain level. These did not incent ransomware that was a $5 million ransom, because that was more than the policy limit. But there were lots of, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 demands because they knew what the limits were. So that kind of interaction, that kind of dynamic is one that the insurance companies, the municipalities, law enforcement all have an interest in defending against. Now, the good side effect is one that, again, echoes what happens in the real world or in the world of hard assets. If you have a company, let's say you have a small manufacturing facility, and you want to insure that facility, the odds are nearly certain that you will get a visit from the insurance company. They'll walk around and they will identify places where you have risks. And in many cases, they will demand that you fix those, that you address those risk factors before they will underwrite the policy. And in that way, they actually improve the conditions within the physical facilities. Well, we're seeing the same sort of thing in cyber, where if a company wants to have an insurance policy, the insurance company will come and say, we want to look at your IT infrastructure. We want to see what your segmentation is like. We want to see what your policies are in terms of zero trust or authentication or identity. We want to know the kind of encryption that you're using and what the strength of the protection is at the cloud service providers where you're storing things. So all of that goes into actually improving the IT infrastructure of the companies that are getting insurance. Cyber insurance is now part of the risk landscape at companies of all kinds of sizes. And Brian, I want to turn to you first. Is this something that you think we really should have had for years? Do you think this might have had a positive impact on some of the companies that have been hit by major incidents in the past decade or so?
Well, obviously, we're talking about people learning from their mistakes. I'm going to go back in history, back into the 70s, and set my Wayback Machine because Mr. Peabody's here. And I'm going to say, do you remember Banachek? You know, it was a great show about a private eye that went to go and find out about insurance issues, mostly insurance fraud. We need, I think, in our industry, the equivalent of Banachek for cybersecurity. You know, I put it in the same category as arson. If we were just going to insure an infrastructure, a building for arson, obviously, people need to go and work with the insurance companies to make sure there are things like sprinklers or fire suppression or safe electrical systems and things like that people aren't using extension cords improperly. It's only really just starting to happen in the world of IT. We've got way too many people that I got a brother-in-law with mad skills, and that's fine. But the problem is we have people going in that say they have the skills. They've got a great resume, but they're not got the experience. They don't have the certifications. I'm not even sure I'd like the word certification, but they have the experience to go and secure their systems. It's really not happening. And it needs to happen. The insurance companies, I think, need to get involved because they're hemorrhaging money due to ransomware. And it's just got to slow down. It's got to stop eventually. We got to start removing the low-hanging fruit. And I think that's going to happen over time. But we need the education. We need people with the experience. And I don't know. Something's got to happen eventually. Lou, you know, there's a lot of interesting things happening. What are you seeing?
You know, the interesting thing here, I was talking to Curtis in the back channel here. I mean, one thing that a lot of these cyber insurance companies don't cover are things like, you know, BEX scams, like business email compromise scams. And this is the type of attack surface where somebody, you know, burrows in, gets an email account, or even creates their own email account, or you know, messaging account, or so on in a company's interests on their network or whatever, and they start sending out data and communications in as if they were the company, and it could cause problems. Like they can exploit the company, and they can, and exploitation can sometimes be even worse for a company. Or leaking their data that way, than sometimes ransomware, because again, they can destroy the company's trust in the company, and so on and so forth. And so these types of insurance programs, they don't cover all the different attack surfaces. They're getting more sophisticated. Obviously, DDoS attacks and other things they can cover, and ransomware, but some of the other ones that are harder to track and harder to audit are the ones that cyber insurance companies are not covering. And so being able to pay for services that can help with that. Again, we just talked about advanced threat protection. I mean, obviously this is part of that. But again, there's a lot of other things that go along with it, obviously, because now you have phishing attacks and other things that where now you're compromising your users, where your users are being the weakest link here, and they're leaking data. And they're, obviously we heard about the Twitter breach a while back. And, they're saying that, oh, wait, a customer service agent actually, created the problem because they reset a password. And then that password then became compromised by another user who then used it to borrow into the systems. Well, okay, is that covered? Because your own person who wasn't trained well enough gave up the information that leaked, that now let this data leak and the account leaks. So I think that there's a lot of places where there's, where we'll continue to find where you can't lean on cyber insurance. It could be like we said in the title, it could be a double-edged sword. You could be leaning on it too much when in fact there's a lot hiding under the covers. Curtis?
No, I think that this is one of those things where what we're going to see over the next probably 2 to 5 years is a continuing evolution of risk and insurance in corporate IT. I think that it will become far more normal to have the insurance company be a partner, in the same way that we see cloud service providers now as regular partners of enterprise IT. We'll see the insurance companies be regular partners of enterprise IT. I think that's probably good, especially because in the same way that we have managed service providers with security who can provide a level of expertise that many companies just can't afford, we have the insurance companies who are able to provide a level of risk analysis and risk remediation that most companies can't afford. It's one of those good things, but it's going to take us a while to get to that really good place. Fortunately, that will give us here at TWiT something to talk about for a long time to come.
It will. Well, folks, all good things must come to an end. You've done it again. You've sat through another hour of the Best Dang Enterprise podcast in the universe. So tune your podcatcher to TWiT. I want to thank all and everyone who makes this show possible. It's a team effort, and we have the greatest team in the market, and that's my co-host. We had a great show today. Thank you, guys, starting with our very own Mr. Curtis Franklin. Curtis, what's going on for you in the coming week, and where can people find you?
Lou, I'm going to be doing more research, more analysis, more writing, and hopefully sometime in the next week or so, you'll start to see my first pieces as an analyst back on Dark Reading under the Omdia tab. So look for me there, and as always, when I get those pieces up, you'll see it first on my Twitter feed, so follow me at KG4GWA on Twitter. Follow me at Curt_Franklin on Instagram. One way or the other, I'll let you know what's happening and look forward to hearing from you what I should be looking at.
Thank you, Curtis. I'm looking forward to those pieces. Well, we also have to thank Mr. Brian Chee as well. Cheebert, what's going on for you in the coming weeks? We're going to find you traveling anytime soon. And where can people find you online?
I most certainly hope so. We'll see. The first set of people coming in is this Saturday, and we ought to see what kind of visitors we have to our home now that it actually looks absolutely brand new, which is like, why didn't we do this sooner? Wow. Anyway, I'd really, really love to hear from you. On Twitter, I'm ADVNETLAB, Advanced Net Lab, and love to hear from you. You're also welcome to throw me an email. I'm Cheebert, spelled CHEEBERT. My students and I had a Dilbert theme. So I'm Cheebert at twit.tv. But you know what? It's probably better. Why don't you hit TWiT at twit.tv? And that hits all the TWiT hosts. We would love to hear your show ideas. Love to hear your feedback. I understand not everybody's going to love every single episode we do, but you know what? Feedback is good for the soul. So we'd love to hear from you. Anyway, you folks stay safe, and hopefully in the not too distant future, I'm going to be Curtis Franklin's neighbor.
Indeed. Good luck with all of that. Well, folks, we have to thank you as well, because you are the person who drops in each and every week to watch and to listen to our show to get your enterprise goodness. And we want to make it easy for you to watch and listen and catch up on your IT news. So go to our show page right now, twit.tv/TWiT. There you'll find all the amazing back episodes, the show notes, the host information, the guest information, the links of the stories we're doing during the show. But more importantly, next to those videos there, you'll get those helpful subscribe and download links. Support the show by getting your audio version, your video version of your choice. Listen on any one of your devices or any one of your podcast applications, because we're on all of them. So definitely subscribe and stay on top of your enterprise and IT news. Now, after you subscribe, you want to impress your friends, your family members, your coworkers, give them the gift of TWiT, because we talk about a lot of great topics on this show, and I can guarantee they will find it interesting as well. Now, if you have already subscribed and you're available, during the day on Fridays, 1:30 p.m. Pacific time, we do this show live.twit.tv. Come see how the pizza's made. Come see how the show is run, the behind the scenes, all the banter we have and the fun we have here at TWiT. Plus, if you're going to watch the show live, you might as well jump into our chat room. I have the great chat room over here right now, irc.twit.tv. We have a great discussion. We have a lot of fun times in there, and we have a lot of great discussions, and some great questions and some topics come from there. So definitely be part of the chat room if you can be part of the chat room and be part of the live stream. But if you can't watch the show live and you still want to be part of the discussion, that's okay, because we have a great place to go. It's 24/7 discussion of the TWiT community. That's twit.community. Great website. All of the hosts out there, co-hosts, show content. They discuss technology, current events, current topics. Great place to go to have great discussion and be part of the 24/7 TWiT community. Now, remember, it's January. It's time for the TWiT audience survey. That's the annual survey that helps us understand our audience so we can make your listening and viewing experience better. So it's completely anonymous, and it'll only take you about 5 minutes. So if you go to twit.tv/survey21, that's twit.tv/survey21 to take it. It will really help us out. Remember, you can always follow me at twitter.com/LouMM. There I post all the latest and greatest ways, enterprise tidbits as well, but also the latest and greatest ways to customize your office experience, to make it great for your company and your organization. Of course, I have some great good banter out there as well. We have some good conversations with people like you, so definitely follow me and let's discuss. Now, I also want to thank everyone who makes this show possible, especially to Leo and Lisa. They continue to support us each and every week. We couldn't do this without their support, and so thank you for all their support on This Week in Enterprise Tech. And of course, also thank you to all the engineer and staff at TWiT. And of course, thank you again one more time to Mr. Brian Chee, because he's not only our co-host, but he is also our producer, and he does all the bookings and the plannings for the show. So, we really couldn't have all the guests and everything on the show without him. So thank you so much from Mr. Brian Chee for all your support. And of course, before we sign out, we have to thank man behind the scenes, Mr. Am Pruitt. He is the TD for today. And what's going on for you at TWiT this week, and what can we look forward to?
Just continuing to create and dominate with another great episode of Hands-On Photography. Go subscribe now. Had a lot of fun with this week.
Fantastic. Love the mask, too. Well, until next time, I'm Louis Maresca, just reminding you, if you want to know what's going on in the enterprise, just keep TWiT.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? I am Ant Pruitt, host at TWiT TV. Got a question for you. Have you gotten tired of how bad your photos are looking every time you post them to Instagram? Better yet, have you gotten yourself a new camera and you can't quite figure out why the images just don't look that good? Well, I have a solution for you. This is my show, Hands-On Photography. Each and every Thursday, I sit down and share different tips and tricks that are going to help make you a better photographer and a better post processor. So subscribe today at twit.tv/hop to learn more.